guys, just finished this guy up. So this is a rear sump pan. Made this a little differently than how we normally do. The rear portion from here back is a 6-cylinder pan, and the front portion is a 5-cylinder pan. The reason that it's like this is I was actually planning to use this as a dry sump pan, but changed my mind and decided to add a wet sump. So I added some additional capacity. As those of you that were following the Futura build know, you know that this sump had to be shortened in this dimension a little bit, but on the wagon I want as much oil capacity as possible. This should amount to about 9.5 quarts, and I was thinking about on the inside doing like fancy baffling, but I'm not going to be taking any corners at any significant rate of speed, so we're just gonna go with a regular old open sump. And I left this portion of the 6-cylinder pan intact so that when the oil comes back here, it'll not run up the back of the engine and should stay relatively collected around the oil pickup. So the next thing we're going to move on to is we are going to prep the bullet for the chassis. So this is a 2006 Vortec 4200, and we're going to pop the oil pan off and just generally get the thing ready for install. So let's get to it. Alright, about to pop the pan off, and I figured I'd show you this neat little Easter egg that GM left for us. If you notice in the stock pans, they have a threaded hole here, and that is so that you can screw one of the bolts you just took out of the oil pan rail into here, and then basically jack the oil pan away from the engine. This is because they chose to use silicone to seal the engine, and that can be notoriously hard to get to separate. So you basically just screw the bolt in there, tighten it up, eventually it'll separate. Another thing I wanted to point out is you'll notice that the engine is right side up when I take the oil pan off. Now it would be a lot easier to flip it over and take it off like that, but we like to take the oil pan off with it right side up. That way if there's any garbage collected in the bottom here, it stays in the bottom and doesn't make its way up there where you can't see it. So we'll drop the pan, see if there's any garbage in it, you know, because this is a junkyard motor and we don't know what the condition is, and obviously it turns over, but if there's any garbage in the oil pan, we want to see it. So let's pop this pan off. Alright, now that we got the oil pan off, we can look inside. As you can see, it looks pretty clean. Pretty happy with what I see here. I don't see any chunks. Obviously I'll drain this oil out into a disposal bin, and I'll really see if there's any chunks then, but so far so good. Alright guys, so I have this thing about as torn down as I need it to be, and from what I see so far, this thing's in great shape. So there's not excessive sludge buildup. So somebody obviously took care of this. So normally we would only take this valve cover off in order to clean and paint it. But in this case, we're doing a little bit more. So this will be the very first time that we are running aftermarket camshafts. Now I should say they are regrinds of the factory camshafts, but they are much larger in duration and lift. So the factory cams, it's around like 380 on the exhaust and like 414-ish on the intake. and they only have like 175-ish degrees of duration. The reground cams, which I got through Schneider Racing Cams, they get the duration over 200 degrees on both camshafts and get them over 400 lift on both camshafts. So in order to run them, I will need to upgrade my valve springs. These are the factory Beehive valve springs that came on the 2006 and later engines, and they are already very close to coil bind with the peak lift. As you can see, the factory runs them, I mean that's not even full lift, and they run it like right up against coil bind, which is a little sketchy in my opinion, but what do I know? I just rotated the engine a little bit more to get it to the peak lift, and you can see that spring's like pretty much bound up. I mean, there's a little bit more room, but not a lot. Also, when you're running a reground cam, you need to plan on running lifter shims. So you may say, hey, this is a dual overhead cam engine. Lifters, what are you talking about? Well, the dual overhead cam engines, some of them still feature a lifter. You can see it right there. It's that little guy that sticks down in the engine. And when you regrind a cam, in order to make it larger, what you have to do is you have to take the base circle of the camshaft and make it smaller so that the lobe looks larger. But when you do that, your geometry here changes. So in order to compensate for that, you need to get this little guy spaced up a little bit so that it compensates for the change in the base circle. What I'm going to have to do on this engine is I'm going to have to get some lifter shims. I found some lifter shims that are for a Kawasaki motorcycle that should do the trick. The diameter of the lifter is 12 millimeter. The diameter of the shim that I found was 10 millimeter, but I think it'll be fine. And then the other thing is I need to change the valve springs, like I was alluding to before. So I need to make myself a little tool in order to change those springs more easily. I do not plan to remove this cylinder head because there's no reason to. There's no reason to waste a head gasket and deal with the pain in the butt that the factory head bolts are. So far we have found that the factory head bolts are more than adequate for the power that we're running. We've never had an issue with any of that. Alright guys, here's what I came up with. So first off, I have this bar bolted to the top of the engine. I made this little piece of flat stock into a support bar, and basically what this is going to do is it's going to hold the cam sprockets up and keep them tension so that the crank sprocket doesn't skip any teeth. And then also I got zip ties around the cam sprockets so that they don't skip any teeth. And then I made this little tool. So essentially this will bolt down on my bearing caps on my cams, and then it will push down on the valve springs. Obviously it's not in situ at the moment, it is just laying on top. Obviously I still got to take the cams out, so we're going to see how it works. Obviously it doesn't have to be pretty, but yeah, so we're going to take these cam sprockets off and then unbolt the cams evenly so that they don't snap, and then we're going to start changing valve springs. So let's see how it goes. Alright guys, so I've encountered a bit of a problem when looking at the lifters on the intake side. So the problem is the bottom of the lifter bore is exposed to the rest of the engine. So if you look down this lifter bore, you can see my screwdriver. So there's nothing to actually keep the lifter shim from popping out of here and down into the engine, and that's not necessarily a problem, but you'll lose your lash, and the camshaft will start to make lots of noise, and you could burn up camshaft if it goes really sour. So we got to get a little bit creative. On the exhaust side, there is a clear pocket for the shim to sit in, so no worries there, but on the intake side, we're going to have to come up with something creative. Since there's no way to retain this shim in the lifter bore, we need to come up with another solution. What my dad and I came up with is we need to basically weld this guy onto the bottom of the lifter. We need to take this thing apart, which it looks like there's just a little crush sleeve on top there, and then we need to take the spring out, weld it on here, and then reassemble the thing. So let's take this thing apart. So the best way that I have been able to find on how to disassemble this thing is you chuck it up in your vise, and you take a screwdriver and you just gently pry this guy until the thing comes off. So I got this thing pulled apart. This is the little spring I was talking about. So we got to take this part, clean it, and weld the shim to it. So definitely going to need a TIG weld for this, but this is what it should look like when you're done. So we just got to do this 11 more times. Now, reassembling this thing is basically the reverse of taking it apart. One little trick I've found is taking a 5/16 socket and then pressing the crush collar back onto the lifter, and then you want to take a little tiny punch like this and peen the thing back over, make sure it doesn't come apart. You know, it's generally going to be in compression all of its life, so there's very little chance that this will actually pop out, but just make sure, get it so you can install it, and then clean this up with some Scotch-Brite, and you're ready to install. Alright, I skipped a few steps, but here we are. The engine is ready to be dropped into the car. Some quick tips. Make sure that you drill and tap your front oil pan dipstick, because we will not be using that because we're running a rear sump. Also, when you're installing your damper, make sure that you check the interference, because if it is off, you will try to put the balancer on and it could be too tight, could be just right, you never know. But I tried to put it on and it was too tight, and I ended up putting a little bit of a mark in here because it was going on crooked, and didn't realize it until I was partway on, and yeah, it was basically damaging the damper. My dad ended up running it to a friend's house and he honed it out to the proper spec. And then the other thing is you need to make sure that this is pinned. So I basically modified an LS damper pinning kit and drilled it for the smaller crankshaft snout that the 6-cylinders have. BHJ gives you very clear specs as to what they require. This engine is ready to drop in the car, so I just need to get it up to the car and get it installed. So let's get to work. Alright guys, about to drop the engine in the car. Some tips here. First off, you'll notice that the adapter is a little different than the style we typically run. This is only only encompasses the top half of the engine. So we're gonna try this out. Also, notice the extended dowel pins. I bought those through JEGS. They're for motors that are running a mid plate, but they work on this too. You'll have to take the stock dowels and I recommend you weld a bolt to them and then use a slide hammer to pull them out. Additionally, the flex plate had to be re-drilled for the torque converter pattern that I am running, so that had to be taken off and drilled. And additionally, we had to drill holes on the back side of where the Chevy bell housing bolts up so that the bolts have somewhere to go. You don't want them bottoming out against the engine. Also, something different for this car is we are running a small block Chevy style mini starter. I bought this piece through MTech Motorsports. It is meant to take the small block Chevy mini starter things and it bolts it to a 4200, and the reason that I'm doing this is the stock starter has a piece that comes out like this. It protrudes out like this and basically forces you to have to modify your bell housing on your transmission. If I ever want to put another engine combo, say I wanted to go back to the LS in this car, this makes it so I don't have to modify the bell housing and always have a hole in my bell housing, which will just be ugly and make the transmission case weaker and whatnot. So I chose to buy this piece. It was like 240 bucks. So I think I bought the last one that he had, but you can get, I believe you can get some through Pole Hill Racing as well, just for your information. So I'm gonna drop this thing in and we're gonna get this thing in the car and start wiring and doing everything else that needs to be done. So let's get to it. How we prep these engines for a decent amount of horsepower, I think that's where we're going to end off this video. So make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.